There's always, always, always been tremendous pressure at the fault line. Of Jesus, it said he came to that which was his own, and they did not receive him. Jesus, could be explored, and we do explore it endlessly in our teaching, but he was a change agent and made pretty much everybody uncomfortable, and then redeemed. But that discomfort. So here's our leadership assignment, men and women. With one foot on each side of the fault line, we have to discern the difference between biblical function and temporal form, the difference between that which must never, ever change and that which must often change. So I'm going to move pretty fast, but a couple of recommendations here. Discerning constructive change. Remember that change is about you as a leader, so you have to be honest with yourself, about yourself. Who are you? What baggage do you bring to the change equation? What are your personal strengths? You need to have some self-knowledge. What are your personal weaknesses? I bring a lot of German to the table, more than I thought when I was a younger leader. Some assumptions. And my wife has helped me, ladies, to decompress a little bit, but it's still, you should pray for her as she works with me. If I'm sort of in charge of the environment, which I sort of tend to be, then like a meal, if it's going to be at noon, anytime between 11:59 and 12:01 is fine. But 11:59 is better than 12:01. So I married a Scandinavian girl, and I realize now that you can actually call a noon meal something in the middle of the day. And sort of people start arriving around noon, and I now eat before the family gatherings. It helps me to be more gracious as we sit down and pray together. And I chuckle about that, but that was a real transition for me. And I realized, there is another way to do this. It doesn't have to be military, It's crazy. But self-knowledge will help you. In your church world as well. You're not the same as every other leader. You're not the same as every church member. You're not the same as every leader in your district. So some self-knowledge helps us. Change, of course, as I suggest, is about people. We need to be humble and teachable. One of my mentors, Ron Clausen, wrote for Leadership Journal way back. Still does once in a while. He was a Phoenix boy who ended up as a pastor in Brewster, Nebraska, at that time, the smallest county seat in the United States. I think there were like 40 people in the town. And he built a wonderful church, but he had never seen, basically, other than pictures of cow, and now he's in the Sandhills of Nebraska, where cows outnumber people by a wide margin. He amped up and bought some cowboy boots with round toes that were comfortable, and realized that nobody within 125 miles had a round-toed boot. You could skewer brats on the tips of those boys' cowboy boots. And of course he stuck out then. He didn't know from a steering wheel. But he had this going for him, and God has honored it. Ron's a world-class leader. He had a teachable spirit. So he bought a set of, we used to call them cover balls. They're you slip into it, it's like the big zipper, boom. And they were brand new. Nobody else had brand new ones either. But they were brand new. Put them in his trunk, went to visit his ranchers, got knocked down in cattle pens, helped with branding, helped with other things that I won't explain that you do with cattle. Demonstrated that he didn't know a thing about anything, but that he was willing to learn. And here's what happened over a period of just a few months. All of those very, very independent ranchers said, you know what? This boy's willing to learn from us. Why don't we go in on Sunday and learn from him? Church just kept growing. He didn't know a thing, basically, about that environment. Didn't matter. That's ought to encourage you. As we shift from context to context, if we can take with us a teachable spirit, allow our people to teach us, get us grounded, they'll accept it. That builds credibility. And they will begin to be open to our ministry as men and women of faith. Be humble and teachable. Are you aware of the presence or absence of margin in your life? How are you coping with change? are those changes within your control or beyond your control? I'm introducing more things than I'll be able to discuss today. Changes about motivation. Be honest and transparent. Answer the question, why? As you lead, they have to understand why. They may or may not agree with the why, but it has to be clear. It has to be clear. Can't assume. Is it necessary? Are there alternatives? Does it relate to survival? Does it relate to achievement? Be clear about that. What will it cost? There's always a cost. Now, in some cases, that might be money, but much more frequently, it's time, it's effort, it's stress. It's the rearranging of the routine that we're familiar with. And who's going to bear that cost? Got to answer those questions. We'll have some Q&A here in just a few minutes. Change is about culture. Most acceptable change initiatives meet these two criteria. Biblically based, that's foundational, but also culturally sensitive. Contextually sensitive. Now, I would warn you against, you can't compromise the biblically based in order to be contextually sensitive. Makes sense? But you do need to be contextually sensitive. The Apostle Paul, again, is a model there. So he never compromised the message, but he delivered it in quite diverse ways, depending on the audience, and responded in different ways in different situations. The criteria for changing a ministry must take culture into account, but be directed by biblical truth. There's our key verse for contextual sensitivity once more. The reason that the Apostle Paul was as contextually sensitive as he was is that he wanted the maximum amount of people to come to Christ. So he wanted to remove whatever obstacles he could and connect in the best ways that he knew how. In his diverse ministry settings. Change is about the work of God in the lives of men. Jesus is the arbiter of all eternal change. We can't affect change. We can be a catalyst, we can be led by the Holy Spirit and need to be, but change is a God thing. A sidebar, and I have to be careful of time here, a sidebar, there are small changes that can happen quickly. But often in ministry, we long for macro changes that take huge amounts of investment, even on the part of the Lord in a fallen world. So if you have served on a mission field, you have undoubtedly longed to make that location in the globe more like America, which is familiar to you. If you have crossed cultures contextually in America and are pining for that which was, you may be praying sometimes, basically your prayer is, God, make this little town more like a suburb. Or, make this suburb more like a little town. Well, God can and does change culture, but often He takes a lot of time. Example, slavery. If you've read, or had contact with the life of William Wilberforce, his entire lifetime, arguably, was invested in pressing the English judicatory, the powers that be, to take that issue up. And there was some wonderful evidence of God's work in that, but it took him a lifetime. It spilled over here, and a decision was made in the mid-1800s as God's people prayed. And 100 years later, we were protesting on the streets. A century later, it was still on the block as far as actual implementation. There's a longer discussion so we can get into, but you understand what I'm saying there. So, for the most part, the huge macro changes will either take a lot of time or a major crisis. And so, we are best served, I think, by working with other dimensions lower on the change ladder in terms of our initiative. Our responsibility to discover and cooperate with His plan. Very familiar Old Testament reference that moves us in that direction. Quite a bit of material here real quickly. Lyle Schaller has some insights on change. One of the major risks of innovation is that we'll succeed. And that life will never be the same. Power often appears to be greater in the mind of the beholder than it is in the hands of the holder. Pastor, would you just get this done? Let's totally reface how the people of our church respond to this issue by Thursday. Because you're the pastor. Why would they not respond to you? Principal obstacle to changing our culture is not the concentration of power, but now the diffusion of power. There's power everywhere. How do we ever miss it? Controversy, says Schaller, and conflict are unavoidable. While conflict appears to be over the immediate issue, the larger terms it's over change and the anticipated consequences. That's good insight. Let me repeat the earlier thing. It's a really important. More countercultural the change is perceived to be, the greater the resistance. I'm going to hydroplane here a little bit. Change is essential. Christ is unchanging. Context is ever-changing. Message is unchanging. Methods are ever-changing. Mission is unchanging. Mission field is ever-changing. Now there is some teeth in this equation, and that is that a refusal to adapt, sinking in our heels, is, when it comes to ministry, an act of rebellion against God. Not every act of resistance is an act of rebellion against God, but if we never navigate biblical mandates, we are rebelling against God. Just some practical stuff, real quickly. Whenever possible, choose friendship over confrontation. Yep. Use local ceremony in the introduction of change as often as possible. If you can, introduce it in a way that doesn't violate patterns or roles with the people with vested interest, the stakeholders. If you can, but sometimes it will. Build upon what is known and practiced. Ensure that sustaining the change does not depend on the presence of an outsider. Those of you that are in the midst of consultations, keep that in mind. It's good to get consultation from the outside, but don't allow a consultant to initiate something that a consultant would have to maintain, because it's going to be with you very shortly. And if you can't maintain it, you're going to be in deep weeds. And keep central the role of the Holy Spirit. Spiritual and cultural steps, fairly basic, but we need to be reminded of those. Prayer, job one. Job one. Anytime you initiate a redemptive change, you are whacking a hornet's nest on the dark side. And you're going to buzz around you. The more fundamental the change, the greater the stress. Do a lot, pastors, preaching pastors, do a lot of this. Preemptive, preparatory preaching. And there are biblical examples, of course. Acts 15 is an excellent one. There are others where they really have to work through some deep stuff. I need to actually get that passage, you're familiar with it. And they made it. They did well. It seemed good, they said, but notice, you remember their conclusion. It seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us. Yeah, so sometimes as we press in, we can't come with this unction of heaven and everything that we're pushing forward. Say, well, and some pastors have tried that. God says, well, now be careful. Because if this thing fails, you just declare that God doesn't really have a clue what he's doing. So I like what they did. It seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us. And they were navigating some huge, way bigger than we can measure in our cultural context. Build loving relationships. This is also a preemptive thing. It's a lot easier to navigate change with people you love, in most cases. The greater the love, the greater the capacity to maintain fellowship in the face of change. Here's an important one as well. One-to-one communication with decision makers. Don't just blindside your key influencers. Maintain biblical integrity. Remember that the likelihood of embracing the destination is proportionate to understanding the route. I've got an illustration almost done here. Rely on key persuaders and diplomats. Be careful not to manipulate, but there are people of influence in your ministries. And when they have bought into the change, it's highly likely it's going to go. But if they haven't, it's highly likely that you're going to go. Not a prophet. It's possible anyway that you're going to go if and they may not occupy the formal positions of authority. There were some folk in my first church that had to really understand what we were doing that did not sit on the board. Identify similar innovators. It's always great if you can say, you know, this thing is really big for us. It's going to be complex. But the Free Church Inn has just navigated these waters. I think we ought to take a team, men and women over there and talk. Let's do that. Let's find out, you know, what they went through. Without any commitments attached. Let's just go over there. Use history and tradition. Here's the illustration. And I do have a watch. So in our first church, we outgrew our building. It's a long, long story, but the time came when we had to face the unthinkable, and that would be to relocate into a new building, and that was just huge, 103-year-old church. And as I navigated the history, and I sort of stumbled into this, there were 2 or 3 crises times in terms of actual growth in the history where they had chosen to build. Now, very modest, very, very modest. The one was they needed to be underneath the 50 by 50 foot building. A basement made sense. I wish I could give you the whole story. Some of it's in the appendix to the book. I interviewed 2 patriarchs who had been there. One of which I allowed on a Sunday morning to tell his story. There was hardly a dry eye in the place. I said, Buddy, tell us about the building expansion of the basement. Well, yeah, we didn't have any place for fellowship, so we thought we would build a basement. He said, work-worn, 80-something guy. So a friend of mine, he's with the Lord now. A friend of mine, I got the wagon and the horses and pulled up by our window well. We started digging. I went in on my side under the building, and I would shove the dirt to the window well, and my friend would shovel it into the wagon, and then we hauled it out and dumped it. You know, after a while, we had a basement. Now, I get emotional talking about this. We had a church bursting at the seams of young people who were saying, let's get the show on the road and get out of this antiquated building and get into something that'll work. What are we waiting for? They were among those who were crying. Do you suppose it cost Ruddy anything to say goodbye to that building? When he dug the basement with a shovel, by hand, when he laid up the boards to pour the cement footings? Now, it had to happen. And I stumbled into that. I wish I was that smart. I'm not. I stumbled into that. God showed up there and said to our young, hard-charging leaders, look at what this cost. This antiquated, paint-peeling, inadequate place. Look at what that cost. And then it gave a little openness to the heart of our older people to say, you know, yeah, we're out of space. And it's been a long time. But what I was able to say then in our little self-published literature about the project is this, and you will know because I've set this up, what I'm going to ask you. I said in the little publication, the time has come to arise and build again. Which is the most important word? Again. Again. We've done it before. We did it with the basement. We did it with the 1930s Sunday school room. Now those are big gaps, but we've done it. We've survived it. Time has come. Even this, though this was much larger, they could navigate it. How has God used your work? How has God worked in the past in your ministry's history? Sample the change. Oops, sorry about that. Evaluate. And, sorry, I will give you access to the notes later. Allow time for God to work. Here's that hierarchy of change. Cosmetics, easy. Paint the wall. Infrastructure, more difficult. Human behavior, very difficult. Human values, extraordinarily difficult. Culture, give God some centuries. And finally, draw inspiration and encouragement from those who have faced greater change and succeeded. We have shed blood in our striving against sin. Gonna close, I promised you 3 times, gonna close with, with the 4 greatest all-time change facers. That's a phrase I just made up, change facers, okay? In descending order. Number 4, Moses. Loss of family, exile, an incredible call, an amazing exodus. Talk about stress. 2 million in the congregation, oofed up. In his office out there with the sun lined to the horizon, father-in-law said, get some help. And no promised land. Expectation all the way up till, whoops, that didn't go well. Number 3, Noah. Can you imagine? Pre-flood, post-flood. Number 2, Adam and Eve. The only ones among us that have seen the other side and lost it. And unsurprisingly, number 1, Philippians 2. I am utterly convinced, and we're done now, it's Q&A for 5-6 minutes. I'm utterly convinced that we don't have a fraction of the perception of what he left to come here. And when we get there, I think that that's one of the things that will overawe us. We will take a look around and go, I cannot believe it. When we say that in the face of the cross, I think at that day we'll say it in the face of the incarnation. He left this to come here. And so we have some who go before us and have navigated successfully. Even more change. I said it a few moments back that this is the generation that has faced the greatest change, with just a few exceptions. Here are 4. Here are 4. Any questions before we go to the discussion groups? We got the timeline, just a handful of minutes here. Yes?
I was wondering if you have any comments about making a small change in our makeup. There's a few of us here that are white. We're all white. How might a family like ours become, because you also reminded us that we are probably the last generation of majority white.
Yep.
And yet we are majority white here today. We're all white.
Sure. Yeah, so that's a bigger question than I can answer, but I can nibble at the edges of it anyway. 2 or 3 things. It's now politically correct to be racially integrated, with the result that there's a lot of artificial attempts. And there are folk, for the time being, minority who resent being the token face. And so don't do that. If you can honestly and genuinely and biblically minister to a new culture, do it with the love of Christ, and see what he does with it. We're attempting that in my corner of the kingdom with Native American folk who've been beat up for 500 years. It's slow going. Guard your own heart about needless prejudice. It's not color, it's culture which offends us. We can get by the color thing pretty fast. But with the color comes a culture, and that's harder. As a solo pastor in a small town, I caught the first wave of the pressure to integrate. I think we could have driven to St. Cloud or Minneapolis to find the first person of color rather. And so there's a lot of stuff that's being pushed right now that's irrelevant in some settings. Don't apologize for your heritage. There's a reason why most of us here in the room are majority white. That is, there weren't a lot of folk that weren't white in Scandinavia and in Germany. That's our heritage. Now, if we're sitting in close proximity to another culture that we're refusing to interface with, that's sin. And so I think back to landing the plane here. Be alert, folks. Spill water. Sorry, tsunami. Be alert to the opportunities that surround you and move into them and leave the results to God. But don't token it. Don't just add ministries ad hoc so that your tradition looks more like another tradition. Now, those of you that serve in urban locations, There's a different contextual interplay there. But don't make it artificial, make it genuine. Lean in with the love of Christ to meet actual needs. And see what God does with that. Does that make sense? One other, and then we got to break.
You speak a lot to the difficulty of changing culture and perhaps leave it to God. However, many change agents and organizations speak to the critical nature of changing culture, whether it's a football coach or CEO or a new superintendent at a school. So how do you square it's not going to happen with many people saying that's the only way it's going to
They're always talking about microculture. They're talking about changing the ethos of my football team.
Okay.
They're talking about changing the overall tenor of a church or a school or an organization. We can do that. What I'm talking about is macroculture. We want America to be different. We want Minnesota to be different. We want the ethos that surrounds us everywhere out there to be different. That's God's business. Now we can affect substantive change in microculture. Just by giving an example and beginning to work proactively. Great questions. Brian?
Thank you.